Good afternoon, everybody. Let's see if my mic's turned on. It is. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Geoff Garrett, Dean of the Wharton School. It's my real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. It must be an academic event because no one will sit not only in the front row, but the second row. The only person who's in the second row is the Deputy Dean, and I see a Vice Dean in the third row. I hope we can get to you all in the back. It's a great pleasure for me this afternoon, really for two reasons. The first one is that this is another event in our Dean's Lecture Series, which was endowed and supported by the Tarnopol family, a fantastic family at the Wharton School. It gives us an opportunity to do things at the school which we think are of great importance, not only internally but externally as well in the world, and certainly that's true today. We have with us, seated in the very front row and facing you all, Kerwin Charles from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, where Kerwin serves as the Bergman Distinguished Service Professor. He also served, I think, 12 months ago, Kerwin, as interim dean of the school, and he's chair of its Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee. He's been at Chicago since 2005. In reverse order, he was previously on the faculty in public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. He received his PhD from Cornell and his undergraduate degree from Miami. His work, which is broadly in labor economics, ranges very widely. When I was trying to figure out the range of topics, they include gender and race discrimination in the labor market, the transfer of wealth, and I think also the transfer of inequality across generations, the impact of higher education on employment, the impact of adverse health events on families and jobs, the impact of incarceration on individuals' families, and the impact of race and ethnicity on consumption behavior by individuals. So Kerwin's a very distinguished scholar. Those of you who know economics know that one of the distinctions that economists earn is to be a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts, between Harvard and MIT, and Kerwin is a research associate of the NBER. But he's also a walk-on-water teacher, and I knew that he was he had the highest honor that could be bestowed on a member of the faculty at the University of Chicago, which was to be called the faculty speaker at convocation. Now, maybe there are some people in the room who've been to a lot of our convocations. And convocation for us, I think about these Latin terms and I never know quite how they work. But at the University of Pennsylvania, you begin with something called convocation and you end with something called commencement. And it loses in the Latin translation for me. I still don't understand why commencement comes last. Another thing that's true at the University of Pennsylvania is that we have a distinguished speaker who's not a member of the university community give the main speech. So last year at the University of Pennsylvania commencement, Cory Booker, the senator from New Jersey, was the commencement speaker. So two translations from Columbia from Chicago to Penn. The first one is that their convocation is our commencement, but since they're both confusing, let's call them graduation. And the second one is that at the University of Chicago, they don't have a Cory Booker speaker. They only have a professor speak to the graduating class. And in 2014, Kerwin had that honor, which is the highest honor that the university could bestow upon a member of its faculty. So could you join me in welcoming Kerwin Charles to the podium? Let me just say that the way we're going to do this is Kerwin wants to be behind the podium, present a few slides, raise some issues. Then he and I will have a brief conversation, and then we'll open it up to everybody in the audience. And the good news for us is we've got a big countdown clock in the back, so we should be able to orchestrate timing very effectively. Thanks, Kerwin.
Thanks. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to you for coming. I see the title of my remarks today and of our interaction is the economics of race in America. When Geoff described the event to me today, he emphasized that it would be a conversation between the two of us. Given the nature of the topic, it seemed appropriate to me, though, to set the stage, to raise, before he and I talked, a couple of themes that would guide our discussion, okay? So my goal is to spend the next 20 minutes or so setting the stage. So, the economics of race in America. It turns out that thinking about race and inequalities by race is one of the most intensely studied areas in social sciences. And so we have social scientists, natural scientists even, increasingly in medicine elsewhere, thinking about the magnitude of racial differences in any number of outcomes, what factors explain remaining gaps in racial outcomes, and what can be done in the policy sphere to remove the outcomes that remain, the differences that remain. I'm an economist, and whereas economists study lots of outcomes, with Nick, I've written a paper about consumption, thinking about racial differences in consumption. There are economists, including me, who study racial differences in housing and mortality, etc. As a labor economist, I focus a lot on racial differences in labor market realizations, by which I mean, for an audience from the Wharton School, the product of wages and employment. And so I care a lot about earnings over, say, the year, because it is presumed by economists, I think correctly, that an individual's earnings represent an excellent proxy for her socio-economic position. Earnings are interesting in and of themselves, and earnings translate into the other socioeconomic outcomes we care about hugely, okay? And so, like others, I, early on in my career, over the set of papers I earlier described, my work proceeded a certain way. I basically followed the approach that we all follow in empirical economics. Here are some of the things that pop up routinely. One thing we do, almost 90% of the papers you will see, focus on contrasts at the mean. In other words, you'll recall I said I care about racial differences in earnings, yeah? And so it will be the mean difference in earnings between blacks and whites, yes? The mean difference in earnings between Latinos and, okay? Mean differences. Second, we tend to focus a lot on workers for reasons that'll become clear. And so usually, it's mean differences among people who work in particular. And so what I want to guide our conversation with today, what I want to put on the table, is some things that have emerged, some questions, some issues, that I'd like us to talk about. Yeah? Some of these things have been directly studied by me, and some of them are just questions I have. Here's one. Where to compare? Where to compare? There's no law that says we should compare the mean. Yeah? We have a population of people of race A, a population of people of race B. We care about differences between them. Why the mean? Yeah? We could, for example, compare the highest person over there to the highest person over here. Yeah? And so, as heterogeneity increases within a race, the more dissimilar members of group A become one from the other, and the more dissimilar members of group B become one from the other. The focus exclusively on mean differences between A and B seems odder and odder and odder still. And I will tell you later today that within group, differences are growing dramatically year on year, rendering the mean comparison ever more baffling. Yeah? Here's another problem. Remember I said we focus a lot on earnings and pay a lot of attention to workers. But here's what's been happening. In other work of mine, not necessarily related to race, we observe the zero problem, as I describe it here. What's the zero problem? Here's the zero problem. If I look at American men, say, and I ask two questions about them, I say, tell me what you're doing now, like today. That's one question. Are you working? Are you looking? Yeah? That's one kind of point-in-time measure of activity. Yeah? Another question I might ask is, let me ask you something. Did you work last year? Between now and last year, have you worked at all? Okay. For men, prime-age men, men between, say, 22 or so and 40 or so, for most of the country's history, the answer to what are you doing now is either I'm working, yeah, I'm looking for work, or I'm sick. You see? Indeed, the notion of work and maleness are so closely tied together that we haven't thought to interrogate this thing carefully. Yeah? But when we look increasingly at what is true about actual employment behavior, we see more and more zeros. We see zeros among whites and blacks, yeah? And the growth in zeros, meaning non-work, is differential by race, yeah? And we see it both in point of time activity and activity since last year. You are skeptical. Fair enough. Look at this picture. Look at this picture. So this is a picture I created here to ask the following question. Go and ask, look, let's ask about people's current activity. Where are you? Go to the census, look at people's activity. Everything on the right with the little dots in them are white men. Yeah? The thing on the left in a given year, black men, no little dots in them. Two things should jump out at you. One, when I say the growth in zeros here, you see what I mean. Yeah? Tremendous growth in non-employment, and it's especially pronounced among blacks relative to whites. Lots of people have written about why it is that non-employment has risen so dramatically. Its composition is interesting too. Not only is the level high and troublingly growing, but you will notice that that incarceration represents a hugely important phenomenon among blacks relative to whites. Yeah? This is something that was not true before in 1940 or 50. Incarceration was a vanishingly small concern. It is becoming more and more important year on year. But it's not only incarceration. It's every other way we think of measuring current non-participation. Are you out of the labor force? This audience, I think, knows what I mean by labor force. Are you working or are you looking? Good. That's a point-in-time measure. Here's a different kind of measure. A different kind of measure says, have you worked last year? Between this year and last year. Remember, we're talking about prime-age men. Look at this graph. Aye. The thing moves too fast. Prime-age men. The bottom line is white men. I want you to think about what I'm saying here. Prime-age men between 22 and 49. Okay? I should have put my heading. Okay? Just think about that. And so we have in 2014-15, by the way, you might wonder how much of this is a recession thing. Yeah? Have we returned to kind of, it's come down just very little. Roughly, a quarter of prime-age black men haven't worked since last year. Yeah? That's a massive change in the zero problem. And so when you have that going on with zeros, it becomes ever weirder to talk about just the mean or just workers. Do you see? Good, good. That's one thing. Where do we look? We have growing heterogeneity. We have these growing zeros. Looking at the mean seems weird. Here's a different kind of question or issue that comes up. Remember I said anyone thinking about racial inequality and its evolution through time cares both about documenting the size of the gap, and she inevitably wonders, well, why is it changing? Why is it going up or down? Yeah? I want to convince you, or it won't take me long, that there are two kinds of explanations. There are two kinds of explanations. I have group A and group B. And I observed that there's a difference, say, in the mean between group A and B. Yeah? Now, members of group A and B are heterogeneous. Some have high, some have middle, some have low earnings. Yeah? Same thing in group B. Good. Now, I say to you, look at group A and group B have gotten closer in mean earnings. Yeah? They've gotten closer in mean earnings. There are two reasons that might be true. Here's one reason. One reason is that all the earnings in the world could have gotten compressed. Do you see that? And so let all the people in the world be lined up between the wall and here. Yeah? Let that be the lowest level of earnings, let Kerwin be the highest level. Yeah? If I walk towards that part, then mean differences must get smaller. Do you see? Because the gap between the highest and lowest in the population is shrunk. Yeah? That's one kind of change. That mean earnings differences could shrink or expand because of compression and expansion of the earnings distribution. Do you see? The other possibility, of course, is that the earnings distribution shape remains unchanged. And what happens instead is that people, group B, say, advance upon group A. Do you see? And so I change my position relative to group A. How are we doing? We're doing good. Do you see? The one is about compression, the other is about advancing. Thinking of it that way, actually, is good. Because a thing about compression is that compression is kind of race neutral. You see what I mean? That I'm saying, here's the earnings distribution, and I'm just lengthening it and compressing it. And what's happening is that the mean is changing just because of the initial position occupied by blacks. Alternatively, if I say to you that group B members are advancing upon group A members, it means the position has stayed the same, the earnings have stayed the same, but blacks are gaining at every level. That sounds that is race-specific gains, do you say? Yeah? This tension, how much of the gap and its change over time, its evolution, can be associated with or linked to the stretching versus compressing, and how much, on the other hand, can be linked to actual advancing within the distribution, with the latter indicating race-specific gains, is a huge question that I think we should think about very deeply. We've not thought about it enough. Instead, we focus just on the level difference, observing that the mean difference has fallen, but not asking enough whether it is because of the compression I mentioned or the advancing. To make sure we mean what I mean by compression here is an earnings distribution. Play earnings distribution, yeah? I just pretended there's some jobs in the economy, bad, good, and amazing, let's just say, yeah? And what I've done is I've sorted the two races across the jobs. Do you see what I mean? And so this thing here, there's a light. If there's a light, okay. There's a Dean made me do that, I didn't. Okay, so there is no light. Very tall. Very good. Very good. So these are, bad, good, amazing. These are the jobs. Of course, in reality, there's infinitely many jobs filling up the middle, filling up the empty spaces, yeah? And there's some mean difference between blacks and whites, given the allocation of blacks and whites across jobs. Yeah? This thing I say about advancing, you notice in this distribution of jobs, in this hypothetical distribution, there are no blacks in the amazing job. Do you see that? And there are no whites in the bad job. Yeah? One reason the earnings gap might get smaller is if some of these people move over there. You see what I mean? That would be the advancing. Yeah? The other possibility is this thing. You see the distinction? Yeah. This is the stretching and compressing. Yeah? And so thinking about stretching versus compressing and level versus position is another thing we haven't thought enough about. I have this one little paper I just want to show you. I've taken two graphs from a brand new paper of mine. Here are the graphs. In the graph I say, remember this point I've made thus far about don't care only about the mean or median. Think about the whole population. And then don't focus only on the mean, focus on, say, the 90th percentile. Take the 90th percentile black person and compare him to the 90th percentile white person. Yeah? And what we do here in this figure is just compare the earnings difference between the median black guy and the median white guy. Yeah? What you take away from this figure is good and very bad news in a way. Very bad in some ways. Here's the good part. In 1940, the median black guy compared to his white counterpart had earnings 100% lower. Yeah? And what happened between 1940 and 1980? Things got much better. Yeah? But what has happened in the decades since is that today, taking the entire population into account and including the zeros, the earnings of the median black American man compared to his white counterpart is as bad as it was in 1950. Let me say that one more again. The earnings of the median African American man, taking the zeros into account, the gap between him and the median white is as bad as a 1950 gap for the median. Yeah? You will notice that at the 90th, yeah, there has been some convergence and some erosion. The erosion has not been as profound, but there are still substantial gaps there. A different way we might measure people's relative advancing is to ask this thing about position. We might say, Kerwin, let's say you, Kerwin, are at the 85th percentile of the black earnings distribution. Everybody with me? You're at the 85th percentile of the black earnings distribution. Where would those earnings place you in the white distribution? You see? That's a measure of position. Here's what's happened to position. The black line represents the median black man's earnings within the white distribution. You'll observe that the median black man's earnings in the white distribution would place him today at a 25th percentile. You should also notice that's where his granddad would have been, roughly. That's astounding. Okay? You should further notice that there are real gains at the 90th. Yeah? The 90th percentile black man has made real gains. We're going to talk about him going forward. The 90th percentile black man are like the black men in this room and above. They've made real gains. Yeah? Indeed, if I condition on education, the 90th percentile black man, this is not conditioned on education, has made even more gains than this. Hopefully this will come out in our questioning. Good. So this is the level, the compression, the stretching. That's a second set of issues. Third set of issues. So we've got this thing about stretching and compressing versus advancing and retreating within the distribution. I'm going to call advancing and retreating within the distribution the effect of a race-specific change. Do you see why I'm saying that? I'm saying here's the distribution, and blacks have moved forward relative to whites within it. Yeah? Blacks have made some kind of gain relative to whites within the same distribution. Cool? I'm going to say, whenever that happens, that sounds like race mattering, if I may borrow that expression, it's not mine. But if race matters, if blacks within the distribution make gains or suffer retreat, why does that happen? Do you see? There are many reasons. There are many possible reasons. Here's some I listed. I've written on a bunch of these. Here's two. One possibility for within the distribution retrenchment or advance is a thing called discrimination. Perhaps when we observe retreats within the distribution for blacks, there is active discrimination on the part of some set of market actors, employers, co-workers, I don't know. Someone delimiting the life prospects of a black person. It need not be discrimination, it could be preference. Yeah? For example, I say to you, you'll see something I'll show you about education here soon. I say to you that in the year 1950, the country horribly mistreated its black citizens in terms of the education it provided them. We have, later on, a massive decision, Brown v. Board. The result of the Brown v. Board decision is that whereas states in the South formally excluded blacks from good education, they were forced to make up the difference. That's a race-specific change. It benefited blacks. Yeah? And so the question is, for us, how much of the gains are for discrimination versus preference? Call that one kind of change. Another kind of thing that I believe gets too little attention is what here I call norms versus segregation. When economists and others talk about discrimination, they say, you know, we care about differences between men and women, blacks and whites, Asians, and conditional on skill, they say. Don't you see? I care about the difference between these groups, holding skill constant. And the kind of skill we have in mind are things like education, training, it is kind of like that. But there's this other thing that I've come to believe matters, and I don't have strong evidence for this. It's a suspicion of mine. And I'm going to call it norms, vaguely, loosely. What do I mean? So one of my students at Chicago is interviewing people who are they're hiring. They're seeking employment. A guy might be a roofer, say, yeah? Locksmith. And he's got an ad, and he's invited people coming in and so on. And then the guy comes in, and he hires him or not, and then my student asks him, hey, you didn't hire that, what happened? And he tells her something, and she has a text, which text she can then review. And the people, it's something about, I don't know, man, something about him. Yeah? Many people in the room will know who are economists, or faculty for that matter, that we have job talks. The way faculty are hired, people come give a talk. People come give a talk, and faculty members are arrayed. And the people give the talk. And the thing, and people are asking, were you in the faculty? Now you'd be interrupting me. Hey, Kerwin, what about that? And like that. You'd be doing that. And then you leave. And then the faculty get together and say, are we going to hire, what's his name? Yeah? And then every individual faculty member has his or her own view. And it is thought by some people that when people say things, I don't know why I don't know, something. And you chuckle, and I say this. Here's a thing. Imagine I belong to a group which, for whatever reason, doesn't interrupt a lot. Just imagine that. Like a group of women, say. Yeah? I belong to a group which has a social norm of not interrupting. And so I'm giving a talk to a group of economists. And they're asking me stupid questions. I don't interrupt them. My colleague, yeah, maybe even less smart than me, is used to interrupting people. At the end of the seminar, people say he was very good in the seminar, by which they mean this norm of speech and interruption doesn't so. Economists have paid too little attention to this. It's something that sociologists and others have stressed for a while. It needs to be made precise, made testable, and the like, but there's something there, I believe. And then I've talked about skills and policy. I hope Geoff asked me about this. Right? Here's the thing. Here's something you should think about. How has the country changed in terms of education? Education is the main measure of skill we have and use, right? Here's America in 1970. Yeah? 1970. In 1970, 38% of blacks had more than a high school, black men had more than a high school degree. That's astounding. For someone, I study this, and I'm always shocked by these numbers. And so we observe tremendous convergence in high school attainment, in college, and other things. But we're moving from a place as recently as 1970, where the differences in realized attainment were unimaginably large. And those changes, to the extent we've seen convergence, have been the result of race-specific policy. Something I hope you will ask me is how, despite these gains, and you should ask me too, how, despite these gains in education, do we still have the gaps I just showed you? The gaps with which I began, right? Good, I hope you ask me that. One more slide. One more slide. I'll stop and let Geoff and I then talk. So there's this huge research program. People writing papers and things. And I think there are some things we need to do. I think there are some comparisons we need to make that we have not yet made enough. That those comparisons will be of independent interest and help clarify or sharpen our understanding of phenomena that we think might be going on. Let me give you some examples. One, I think too little is made of the difference in realized outcomes between men and women. So let's say we're talking about economic outcomes among African Americans. And I say to you, this isn't actually true, but suppose I said to you that there's a fact about African American men on the south side of Chicago. Their employment rates are 40% their employment rates of white men. Yeah? Now that could be anything. It could be race-neutral changes, you know what that means now, yeah? It could be race-specific things, you know what that means now, yeah? It could be discrimination, yeah. But then I said, you know what? Their sisters, who have exactly the same schooling, have an employment gap of 6%, let's say. Do you see how that would change, or ought to change, your thinking? So, well, whatever it is, it's not only about, it's complicated. If the women are yeah? And one of the things we see is the difference between men and women across race is so sharp that our coarse, kind of sloppy talking about race essentialism, racial discrimination and the like, it seems to me, is off. We're missing something. Here's the second thing. The second thing is that it's not just that black men and black women have different realizations. That's one thing that's true, which is interesting. Here's the other thing. If you take African Americans, black people, take black people, and then take African Americans who are, say, fourth generation, and then look at the experience of immigrants to America, very different experience. Very different. By the way, immigrant black people. So what is that? What does that show? Or what does it not show? Does it show, within group discrimination by whites towards, or does it show selective immigration? I don't know what it shows. But here's what I do know. That's an interesting contrast for us to examine further. Yeah? We talk a lot about black and white. It's in many ways not weird that we should so do. The black-white contrast in America is interesting for lots of reasons. It is not just something we care about in some abstract way. Its importance for, say, policy making, for the design of the political system, it's hugely important. It's not odd that we would look at that one. It is, however, increasingly odd that less attention is paid to other contrasts. And so I couldn't tell you today, as I stand here, despite spending lots of my time studying this, what, say, the race-neutral effect of convergence is between Asians and Hispanics. I don't know. We don't study that enough. Yeah? There are lots of reasons why we don't. It turns out the nation with its obsessively measured blacks from the very first census. It was very important to know how many black people there were. You see how that would go. Yeah? But it's much, I don't know how many Asians there were in North Carolina in 1870. I don't know. That's a thing. Okay? We need to do more of that than we now do. And I'll close with this. America isn't the only place. Yeah? So I want to know how a disenfranchised group is treated. An historically despised group, even, is treated. Well, there's the American experience. But other places have disenfranchised, maybe even historically despised groups. They exist in South America. They exist in Australia. They exist in India. Yeah. And so situating these black-white contrasts in an international context will help enrich our understanding of the forces at work that govern the disparities I showed you several slides ago. So I'm going to stop here and then have Geoff ask me searching and difficult questions.
Thanks very much, Kerwin. And I'm sure I'm going to disappoint you because you've already told me what you want to ask, and if I don't do it effectively, I've failed. But we are creatures of our background, and I think you've thought clearly, you've thought deeply in the way an economist should about how one should do comparisons. But you're also a public intellectual, and by training, I'm a political scientist. So I want to ask you to step outside. Take your economist hat off a little bit, or rather be an economist-informed public intellectual. So let me see if I can do that quite quickly, just by asking some of the biggest questions as I see them, some of the things that you've touched upon. So the first one, your observation about the growth of the zeros and the decreasing meaningfulness of unemployment, I think is profound, right? How can we have so much distemper in the country when the unemployment rate is 4.5%? Very important question. You've also documented the relativities in employment, and I think what you've said is that the race-based inequalities are higher the further you go down the income distribution. Okay, so let's take that as a fact, but we also know from books like Hillbilly Elegy, Dreamland, etc., that there's this thing called the white working class that is not going very well, right? So in those two books, you get the sociological rendering of it. We could have the economics one as well, which is flat incomes for people at the middle of the income distribution for 15 years. So when you think about the temper of the times, and you've got both of those things happening at the same time, that is, some evidence of stubborn persistence or increasing inequalities lower down the income scale where race is concerned, plus a macro, the white working class isn't doing very well. Maybe you can answer either as an economist or a public intellectual. How do you deal with both of those phenomena at the same time? Or, we can treat them discreetly, but how do you put it together for a sort of what's going on in society view?
Okay. So if you allow me, there are two parts. I'm going to split your question in two. You are right to point out that many of the changes I've indicated here for blacks at the bottom mirror changes we observe for whites. Hillbilly Elegy documents in a very eloquent way the experiences for a certain kind of white person, working class whites. I think what is the striking...
Written, of course, by a white person who ended up at Yale Law School,
yes,
one
indeed.
of the most exclusive and hardest to get into institutions in the country.
In the country, yes, yes, indeed. So you anticipated what I was going to say.
Sorry.
And,
I'll shut up now.
No, this is good. So one of the things I was going to say was that this terrible phenomenon of non-work and dislocation is felt higher up in the left tail of the black distribution than is true for whites.
You're going to translate that for non-economists?
So it is a thing, non-employment or incarceration or whatever, is a thing felt by the 35th percentile black guy. Yeah? Indeed, for black people below the median, the bad things to which I've adverted are a real lived phenomenon. Hillbilly Elegy is talking about a much narrower slice of the left tail. Okay? So it's not felt anywhere near, say, the 35th percentile of the white earnings distribution.
And you know that's empirically true.
I know for a fact that's true.
Yeah.
So that's point one. The second point, though, is this point about intergenerational transmission. Yeah. That, as you say, and as I was going to close with the punchline on which you stepped, I'm teasing. We have this beautiful book, and it's written by a guy who went to the Yale Law School. He went to the Yale Law School. The experiences of African Americans making that transition from the bottomest rung is incredibly rare. Yeah? Indeed, there's a strand of research I do on, you mentioned it, intergenerational transmissions of various sorts. And so we observe in that work, and lots of it done with my colleague Eric Hurst, that it's very difficult, way more difficult for blacks than whites to transition out of the bottom rung intergenerationally. So if I'm born in the bottom 20th percentile, it's difficult for my child to be, say, at the 40th and above. That's true for everybody. It's especially true for blacks. Here's another thing. Whites can transition out of the bottom 40% two ways. Their own earnings can thrust them into the highest thing. And here's the other thing that we found in my work here is with a woman called Sasha Killewald, is that they can marry out. And so blacks don't. And so you're in the bottom rung, the bottom 25% of African Americans. There is this intergenerational thing, means your kid's going to be there too, and you're not marrying out. There's no meeting.
So can I interrupt you there?
Yes.
This is, I'm an Australian. I came to the US for graduate school, so my experience is my own. But my wife's parents are both first in their extended families to go to college. They went to college, they did well. One generation later, their three children all went to the Ivy League. You've talked about the power of education. Is that pathway, is the educational pathway less effective for African Americans or just less available?
I think it's a great question. I want to speak here about the kind of complicated education's effect on the racial earnings gap. It depends hugely on level. Remember I showed you the earnings gap at the 90th percentile? And I said I was not conditioning on education. Were I to condition on education, in other words, were I to go to the United States and focus only on college graduates, you with me? Only on college graduates. And I said among college graduates, compare the 95th percentile black person to the 95th percentile white person. and let me look at the difference in their position in the earnings distribution. You want to guess what it is? Yeah. It's vanishingly small.
Yeah.
It's vanishingly tiny. And so for blacks at the very top, for blacks who go to schools like University of Pennsylvania and are in programs like Wharton, I'm not saying there won't be a disadvantage, but the data are telling us that their experience is hugely different from the median. Hugely. Now, even so, you might say, Kerwin, look at the median, and now let me just flesh out that thought one bit. One reason that might be is that we have observed for graduates of schools like this or Yale or a tremendous opening up of occupations. And so it's not only their entry into Wharton that matters, it's the fact that conditional on having graduated from Wharton, an African-American woman or man in this audience is at risk to be hired by a good financial company or law firm, whatever thing. That was not true in 1980. It certainly was true in 1960. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Good, so we can explain the top. What about the middle? In the middle, we have seen great educational convergence as well. Indeed, if you were to ask someone who didn't benefit from the kind of education you guys have, tell me the most profound change vis-a-vis education that occurred in America post-World War II. She would say, what's it called? That Brown v. Board thing, yeah. She would say. And that Brown v. Board thing is about the middle of the distribution, you see. Yet, despite that, we have not seen convergence in the middle. How can that be? Here's why. Blacks have been caught in an accident of timing. It turns out that the high school completion gap has in fact shrunk dramatically. But exactly as the high school gap has shrunk, the returns to education have been growing. Do you see what I mean? In other words, graduating high school has become less and less important. Do you see? So right at the time that African Americans in the middle went from having an eighth grade education to high school graduation doesn't matter. Going to college matters.
Okay, so I want to get to everyone in the audience.
When I say it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and these are relative terms, but it certainly focuses our attention on universities, yes. Therefore. Okay, so I'll ask you a couple of questions about universities. The first one is about legal cases, Supreme Court cases. So I was telling you that when I first came to the US in the early 80s, it was soon after this Bakke case, which I think was University of California, Davis yes. Law School maybe, where a white man said, you know, I'm all for helping African Americans, but in this case it's just prejudicing me, right? So I'm very happy for you to have affirmative action as long as it doesn't adversely affect me. Yeah. Fast forward, whatever that is now, 35 years, and this case at Harvard about Asian Americans has exactly the same flavor, I think. Yes, it's fine for Harvard to want to practice affirmative action, but it's adversely affecting me, an Asian American man or woman. Yes. What do you think about that argument?
I think that the argument as described is not without merit. If we view entry into selective schools as a kind of prize earned, first past the post, how can you integrate by parts, say? You remember that? Yeah, can you integrate by parts? And the one who could do it quickest, they come to Penn, yeah? And then we observed, here's a situation where Asian Americans using this measure are integrating by parts relative to whites and blacks yep. and whites, mm-hmm. Way better, and we see their income. So I see that. But a thing that has occurred to me is that it's not obvious, I'm not saying it's wrong, it's not obvious that the objective function of a great university in the world as it now is should be the admission of first past the post. It might be. But if you said to me that there existed a great university, no one has said this to me, but if you did, you said there's a great university called Gobbledygookax. And this university has as its aspiration a desire to train leaders drawn heterogeneously from the future society. That's a perfectly reasonable thing for university to desire to do, yeah? the society will be ever more heterogeneous. There'll be people from different places and different types. And I, gobbledygook you, care about the future leaders of every subgroup, some share of them having gone here. Yeah? Then the first past the post metric won't exactly be right. In fact, it'll be strictly wrong.
That's what our great universities are in large measure doing today.
I believe it is. I don't think that they're making that argument clearly. Listen, I want to be understood. I began by saying that to the extent that you believe entry should be determined in some skill-determinate way, first past the post in terms of talent, that modifications to that kind of rule necessarily means something like discrimination or whatever. I'm pushing back against the notion that that's what we ought to do. I'm further saying that if that is what we are doing as great universities, we should articulate that forcefully. In my view, that's nothing to be ashamed of. It's nothing. When I heard it said in a kind of defensive, kind of, oh, I'm sorry you caught us. No. If this is what Yale wants to do, it's something that Yale should be proud of. And so, there are costs to that action. And one cost of the action might be that at the margin, if Yale wishes to ensure that people from the South or women or African Americans or Asians are present, there'll be relatively, groups that show up in relatively large numbers that will at the margin be injured. But so long as selective schools do not admit everyone who wishes to come, there will be some criterion by which the marginal guy has been rejected. Period. There's no, so long as admission to Wharton is selective, here's my guess. My guess is that despite the excellence of the students here, if you were to close your eyes next year and admit the first 25 students you rejected, the first 60 students you rejected, you wouldn't notice it.
Yeah. Okay, so I understand. I think I understand where you're going. So let me see if I can broaden the conversation to diversifying the faculty, something that universities obviously think really hard about and are committed to, and then we observe that that while there's progress, there's not as much progress as we like. So again, because you're an economist and you've already referred to the way that job searches work, I'm wondering what you think about this analogy and what one would do about it. So I won't use a race example at all. I'll use a geography example. So, I think it's the case, Howie Caulfield, the dean of our MBA program, is in the audience, and McKinsey's our largest employer, right? For a very long period of time, over 25 years or so, McKinsey's been the single largest employer of Wharton graduates. Now, if you think about that, it makes great sense for McKinsey to come to Wharton when they're recruiting talent because they've got this track record, there are all these alums, they know how to do it. The search costs for them in recruiting at Wharton are very, very low. There may be a much better student at your gobbledygook a state university in some state I'm not going to disparage.
North Dakota.
And I was going to use North Dakota, but I didn't do it. I'll leave it for you. But it's just not in. McKinsey says, listen, we're not biased. We just can't afford to find that great potential employee at North Dakota State.
Yes.
It's just too costly for us. My sense is that there's a bit of that in the way we do faculty recruitment. We look for where someone did a PhD, who their advisor was, et cetera. Yeah. And those are eminently defensible practices in terms of, how we narrow the funnel in terms of job search.
Yes.
At the university level. So if you were thinking now about mechanism design for diversifying the faculty, yes, we're going to have leadership. Yes, people are going to say it's very important, but it clearly isn't enough. Yeah. What do we need to do on the mechanism side to diversify the faculty in universities?
This is a very difficult question. There's no panacea. There's a menu of approaches that must be undertaken if diversity is the objective. So when I did faculty recruiting, as the interim dean and then as a deputy dean for faculty, I was struck by the narrowness of the set of schools examined. I don't know how many universities there are in the country, but we look at 7 places, always the same. You do too, yeah. You do too, and I'd push back against it. I would say, look, fine, I know the usual 7, 8. Give me 2 more. Give me 2 more. And we didn't hire the people always, but we found people who were credible. We found people who were credible. If you examine, as I said, I might be proven wrong, I don't think I would be. If you look at the people flown out here for job talks on the rookie market, 8 schools. They came from 8 schools. Make it 15. You can do that. We could at Chicago.
So we did last year. Mike Gibbons is in the second row. He really led the effort. Mm-hmm. And we did 2 things last year. We asked all departments to do exactly that. And in some sense, we reduced the constraint by saying, we'll allow the faculty to grow a little bit. Yep. And we had, again, by historical standards, an extraordinarily successful year in diversifying the faculty. Now,
That was one thing.
Okay, so that's not enough.
That's not enough.
All right, what do we do? What else should we be doing?
So this is a scattershot. I think that, look, let's say we wanted to, race is not the only dimension. So gender is another.
We were very successful on women too last year, by the way.
Gender is a very important dimension. If one examines within economics the kinds of topics studied by women, on average, they differ very much from topics studied by men. And so the dean gives a unit a line. Yeah? A dean who is up to speed on what is being studied by people, who says, look, there is an emerging field called family economics, let's say. Mm-hmm. There's an emerging field. There are people being trained at Columbia and NYU. There are people being trained at MIT. Yeah? And I'm going to give you a line. I'm going to give you a line to hire in family economics. By so doing, the dean will ensure that 50% of the people at risk to be hired are women. So there's an expansion not only of school, but of field. Yeah? And then there is investment the dean can undertake, or the school can undertake. The pipeline problem is a real problem. But are there fellowships that might be funded for people who are to do postdocs? Chicago has started such a thing, where people who come out for a job talk, who are just it's just a little bit off, are allowed to stay at university for 2 years under a provost fellowship, and then reapply to the position for which they recently were for which they were marginal. We have, in fact, as a university, hired several faculty of color, from precisely that thing. There are other examples. People in the room have better ones. But what I'm emphasizing is that if this is something that is a serious desire on the part of the school, there must be a scattershot approach employed. And so those are 3 shots I would take.
Excellent. So the clock is ticking down. I want to ask you one last question. Have to be it's a personal question for you. So I know you're a big NBA fan.
I am indeed.
So am I. And Charles Barkley, who said a lot of famous things over time, once famously said, "I'm not a role model."
That he did say, yeah.
So how do you go through the role model stuff in your own head and thinking about your own life?
Now that is a tough question. In this regard, I suspect I'm not especially different from not merely African Americans in the audience, but lots of others in the audience. So what am I doing? I'm writing papers, I'm teaching school, I'm doing this kind of thing. I am aware of my relative rarity in this thing. And so I am conscious about a kind of group obligation. And that group obligation is discharged different ways. It doesn't mean that I am more attentive to my black PhD students than I would be to a white woman who I'm advising. That's not what I mean. But it means that if I can here or there offer an encouraging word or a shared story or something, I will not lie and tell you that I don't. I very much do, and I'm aware of it. Yeah? That's a kind of direct investment I would make. It's not a huge one, but it's a real one. I also think that the role model phenomenon is for me, has been powerfully important. That being a professor is, on the one hand, a wonderful job, very rewarding and fun. One has great freedom. But I believe I have obligations as well. And I think that I would hope that the students with whom I interact say, that's the kind of professor I would like to be, irrespective of race. I would hope they say that. But for people who are African-descended people, I hope they can say, I hope they also say, I could do that too. Right? That there is a certain, in truth, it'd be difficult for a black person thinking about teaching at a place like Chicago or Wharton to come to a conclusion other than doing that kind of thing is hard, and there are probably impediments in the way. He might be wrong, but I don't see how he could come to any other conclusion, yeah? And so, by discharging my duties diligently and with care and energy and so on, I hope to enkindle in him or her the confidence that they could do this too, because they can. So I take the role model thing very seriously. I believe that early on in one's career, this role model thing can be difficult. I have not asked them, I have not met them, but if I were to...
So I think that's potentially a profound point. So can you just talk a little bit about that? So when you're trying to make it, there's a whole different set of pressures and opportunities on you than once you've made it.
Yes.
So talk about that as how you've thought about it as your career has advanced.
So early on, to be a successful scholar, one has to fail a lot. One's got to try. And so this thing works in reverse as well, in the sense that I can be acutely, I can be sort of hypersensitive to how a slip of mine, a failure to achieve something, a screwing up, could affect somebody behind me. And to carry that burden as an assistant professor or as a graduate student, or whatever, is just a terrible thing.
So you're not a risk-averse kind of guy. Did it make you more risk-averse than you think you inherently, innately would have been?
I think so. I think it also made me interrogate too carefully and for too long slip-ups here and there or disappointments. Because whereas, I don't know, I can imagine other people just dealing with the disappointment, I have to think about, well, how is this thing going to be read by, seen by, felt by, and so that's a weight on me. By the way, please don't, I'm not fishing for pity here. Life's been good, I'm just, but the thing I'm saying, to which I'm pointing here is something that I'm sure that the African American students or women, if you're a woman in a field like finance, let's say, Wharton is one of the world's great finance programs. And you go anywhere on earth, people know Wharton finance.
Chicago finance isn't bad either.
We're not bad there too.
Yeah, no, okay.
But you look around, and there's no such thing like gender parity at Wharton finance. There isn't in Chicago. So you're a junior woman there. And there is a woman trying to get her PhD in finance. That's a weight you carry with you. You know how your disappointments are seen by her. You want to reassure her that listen, don't worry about it, that just happened to me, it might not happen to you. Yeah? But you're not doing that, or Mike's not doing that. That's a kind of additional burden on her, that if she cares at all about the group to which she belongs, she will undertake. Yeah? So I think that the students in the room who come from groups that are relatively rare in environments like this know what I'm speaking of. They deal with it now, I'm certain. But I'd like to assure them that the thing fades over time. Because as you move to the next level, people are watching you. They say, look at what, she went to Wharton? She went to Wharton. And she graduated from Wharton. And now she's working at what, yeah? And so keep that in mind, that in the middle of the burden, there's this thing that down the line will have big payoffs for other people you don't even know well. I'd strayed a bit from the question you put to me.
Excellent. So I love that. Thank you very much for both your insight and being so candid.